In 2016, a quarter of Senate seats represented 59.5% of the population. In fact, during the contentious Kavanaugh hearings, a man accused of rape, attempted rape, and various other blackout drunk escapades was given a lifetime confirmation to the highest court of the land by senators representing just 44% of the population. It turns out that the lopsided nature of the Senate is not new. The Senate was actually formulated to be this way. When the U.S. was founded, it was the southern, rural states with high slave populations that were bursting with ultra-wealthy plantation owners, and the increased representation of the Senate, the Electoral College, and the Three-Fifths Compromise was intended to sweeten the deal for those states, to convince them to join up with the Union. The result? Quote, "The most populous quarter of states, represented by a quarter of the Senate, has consistently been home to around 60% of the population." End quote. What's not quite as common is the minority voting so consistently and in high-profile ways against the majority. This happened in the lead-up to the Civil War, as we may recall. It's also not uncommon knowledge that Republican presidents in the 21st century often lose the popular vote and become president anyway. Whenever this is brought up, the right, yes, even liberals, often comment that states' rights are important, that it's important for flyover states to get the same representation, read more representation, than coastal elites. Yes, even you in your lead-painted studio apartment are an elite. Okay, fair play, but why these states? I get that this comes off as an incomprehensible question, but why are the states drawn in the way they are? Should they be? What is the political philosophy underlying the desire to have these specific states represented in this manner? Let me maybe give an example of a states' rights issue from a not long time ago in a place relatively close.
And I can see Russia from my house.
The Soviet system, history and ideology. Prior to the October Revolution of 1917, Russia was known as the prison house of nations, a reference to the Russian Empire's imperial holdings of a large number of colonial and territorial possessions. As a result of these exploitative relationships, large amounts of wealth accumulated in Russia at the expense of its surrounding satellites. This created a conundrum for the Bolsheviks, whose anti-nationalism ideology demanded equality of opportunity for everyone in a material landscape in which that simply was not achievable. Moreover, nationalism was a powerful animating ideology of the time, and it was causing them quite a bit of political trouble pre-revolution and post-revolution. In his book, Marxism and the National Question, Joseph Stalin argues that, quote, "A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture." End quote. Further opining that, quote, "The right of self-determination means that a nation may arrange its life in the way it wishes. It has the right to arrange its life on the basis of autonomy. It has the right to enter into federal relations with other nations. It has the right to complete secession. Nations are sovereign, and all nations have equal rights." End quote. In his book, The Affirmative Action Empire, Terry Martin argues that the Bolsheviks essentially tackled nationalism on the basis of three premises. 1. The Marxist premise, that nationalism was uniquely dangerous as an ideology because it masked class relations and promoted cross-class collaboration. 2. The modernization premise. Nations as we know them arise as a result of capitalism. To quote Stalin, "A nation is not merely a historical category, but a historical category belonging to a definite epoch, the epoch of rising capitalism. The process of elimination of feudalism and development of capitalism is at the same time a process of the constitution of people into nations." 3. The colonization premise. Liberation nationalism is distinctly different from great power nationalism, although still not a desirable ideology. For our present discussion of the Electoral College, I think this first conception is the most important. The idea that nationalism is deployed by the upper classes to mask the real economic, political, and social history and reality faced by the lower classes. Quote, Ernest Gellner has parodied this argument as the wrong address theory of nationalism. Just as extreme Shiite Muslims hold that Archangel Gabriel made a mistake, delivering the message to Muhammad when it was intended for Ali, so Marxists like to think that the spirit of history of human consciousness made a terrible boob. The Awakening message was intended for classes, but by some terrible postal error was delivered to nations. End quote. It's unclear whether or not Gellner believes that all racial theories are true. People often fight over race. Does he think all theories of sex and gender are true? What about religions? Lots of people believe in them. Does that make them all true? I'm not trying to pick on Gellner here. I'm only passingly familiar with his extensive works. Gellner's is simply the argument Martin provides in his book, and I think it's a useful jumping off point. Not because of the argument from popularity fallacy, which is obvious, but the far more subtle equivocation fallacy. The equivocation fallacy can occur when an argument hinges on a word or phrase that has multiple potential meanings. When these phrases, hence meanings, are used interchangeably, this is the fallacy of equivocation. A well-known example of this is, "You're pro-choice, but you don't support right-to-work laws? Why not? Don't you support someone's right to choose?" Someone who is pro-choice does not want the capitalist state to be able to exert property-like control over the bodies of working-class women. Right-to-work laws undermine unions, the building block of working-class power. It's a logically consistent stance, but through the equivocation fallacy, here equivocating on the word choose, it can be made to look inconsistent. In the preceding parody, Stalin and Lenin mean one very complicated thing when discussing nations and nationalism, and Gellner means another. Nationality is not a metaphysical trait or some kind of genetic destiny. Nations have real observable histories with regards to economics, political institutions, social struggles, and so on. They are not merely cultural entities, bureaucracies, or social institutions. What would keep such things going anyway? When Marxists argue that nationalism is a masking ideology, what is meant is the best material and political interests of the masses, perhaps as measured in quality of life and political independence, are served by the recognition of class relations vis-a-vis the means of production. Compare, for example, India, which had a national liberation struggle, and China, which had a national liberation struggle, a right-left coalition against the fascist Japanese and other colonial powers, and a communist revolution. India used to be far wealthier than China. It isn't now. Lenin and Stalin here were making an historical, material argument of political economy, not merely a taxonomic claim. China is arguably the second superpower, or will be in the next decade. India is fomenting war with a nuclear power, trying to annex Kashmir, and generally descending into ethnic terror under the leadership of a sectarian ultranationalist government. The Bolsheviks understood that contradiction between the national liberation and the class struggle, and it was toward this end that the Soviets developed the Soviet of Nationalities. Each republic, as well as autonomous zones, oblasts, etc., got the same number of representatives, meaning the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, population well over 100 million, and the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic, population under 2 million, had the same level of power in this body. This was intended to keep Russia from essentially reabsorbing its old colonial possessions. The economic plans of the USSR saw the more developed republics subsidizing the less developed republics, with the goal that national borders would break down over time, and that as equality of opportunity became realized, there would be no need for such things, which fits into the Marxist idea of the withering away of the state. Okay, that was a long tangent, but let's review. 1. The Soviet ideology of addressing nationality was based around a history of exploitation. 2. The Soviet political structure gave increased representation to minority nationalities. 3. The overall plan was that reparations would be paid, economic equality would be achieved, and that this system would wither away. History of the demarcation of American state lines. So we're back to the original inquiry with regards to the US. Why these states? America isn't a nation of indigenous peoples, but instead a settler colonial project. Quote, "Before the American Revolution, the British Crown created colonies that were diverse in size. After the Revolution, the new bicameral legislature created greater parity among the states with regard to their size and shape. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson provided the underlying principle of all states being created equal, although he actually meant in size." End quote. Professor Gerald Horne notes in his book, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, that it was a boom in sugar and cotton, really slavery, that unseated monarchism and set the stage for capitalist dominance. Quote, like a seesaw, as London rose, Africa and the Americas fell. As one scholar put it, the Industrial Revolution in England and the cotton plantation in the South were part of the same set of facts. The only friendly amendment to this aphorism would be to include the 17th century so-called sugar boom as an antecedent to both. More to the point, as yet another wise writer puts it, without English capitalism, there probably would have been no capitalist system of any kind. As early as 1663, an observer in Suriname noticed that, quote, Negroes are the strength and sinews of the Western world. The enslaved, a peculiar form of capital encased in labor, represented simultaneously the barbarism of the emerging capitalism, along with its productive force. End quote. There was not one singular Europe, however. The conflicts of Muslims against Christians, Protestants against Catholics, etc., gave way to conflicts between what we might recognize now as nation-states. That collapsed into a new settler-colonial alliance in the New World. Quote, the late 16th century's Anglo-Scot wars prepared the ground for the Act of Union of 1707, which, inter alia, invites Scots to join in the colonial and enslaving feast, and ameliorated, but did not resolve, this urgent matter. This attack on London's manpower also intensified the impulse to make up for the shortfall by dragooning Africans. Ultimately, the Republicans in North America were to slice this Gordian knot neatly by way of moving toward a new kind of aristocracy, that is, whiteness, by which Europeans of various stripes could be accommodated as against the interests of dispossessed indigenes and enslaved Africans. This concern was facilitated by the practical desire of English colonists in, for example, Virginia, to trade with the then antagonist, the Dutch, engendering a process that led to a new identity, whiteness, or the leapfrogging of ethnic boundaries and constraints. The influence of the Dutch on events in English colonies, not least in illustrating the value of republicanism, should be underscored here too. End quote. The slavery and colonialism boom concentrated and extracted wealth so quickly that everything else was blown aside. What I'm getting at here is that states like Connecticut or Colorado are not states in the same way that Kazakhstan or Armenia are. States within the US were carved up along latitude and longitude lines, with rivers and mountain ranges being thrown in by necessity, and only managed to achieve official statehood once they had a suitably high white settler population.
I mean, there's no automatic law that people in a territory get to become a state. In order to become a state, they have to win the approval of the existing states, and there's a long history of states refusing to allow territories to become states, even when they have a population that would seem to qualify them for that.
One of the most fascinating takeaways from this book, Daniel, is kind of the predication of white nationalism and whiteness that defined states and gave the qualifications to elevate those statuses to states. Expand more on that.
Yeah, so it's really important to recognize that white supremacy, or the rule or domination by whites, has been a really important force in U.S. history, but it hasn't just shaped lives within the United States, it's also given shape to the United States. It's decided what parts of the country become states, and it's also decided where the borders go. The prevailing logic was a logic of, do these states have a large enough white population? That's what's written into the laws that govern it, and that was the operative logic. And the reason that some territories linger in territorial status for a very long time, for example, Oklahoma, there's more than a century between the time that the majority of Oklahoma is annexed and when Oklahoma becomes a state. And the reason for that is pretty transparent. The people who live in Oklahoma are, for most of this history, by and large, Native Americans. And Congress is unwilling and uninterested in admitting a state that is dominated by Native Americans.
All deviations from this had to do with wealth and power, not really culture or history. Quote, if states' equality was so important, why are California and Texas so large compared to the rest of America? According to Stein's book, Congress didn't create them, they created themselves. And thanks to the discovery of gold in California, and Congress not wanting to risk losing all of Texas by forcing it to dissolve into smaller states, both states were able to retain most of their claims. End quote. We'll see in the next section that the American system functions as the direct opposite of the Soviet ideal. That is, instead of giving extra representation to the marginalized or historically exploited, the political structures within America cement the supremacy of the historical exploiters in the most powerful. History of the Electoral College. Let's focus on the Deep South: Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi. These states, along with Maryland, have the highest black population percentage of any state. DC has the highest percentage. Weirdly, it gets no real representation. Due to gerrymandering and the winner-take-all system of the Electoral College, the black population of these states functionally never gets to elect a single elector or a single senator. You might be thinking that more progressive states with large minority populations like New York or California might make up for this, but you'd be wrong. Even in reliably blue states, it's important to consider that black Americans often have very different political concerns than white Americans, even within the same party. In his 1996 paper on the Electoral College and racial voter dilution, Matthew M. Hoffman argues, quote, "Many states, including California, New York, Illinois, and much of the South, may be conducting presidential elections in a manner prohibited by federal law. Specifically, I argue that in these states, the so-called winner-take-all system of choosing presidential electors, sometimes referred to as the general ticket or unit vote system, potentially violates Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, as amended in 1982, prohibits electoral systems that limit or dilute the ability of racial and language minorities to elect candidates of their choice." End quote. I mentioned already that the Electoral College and Senate systems were meant to entice Federalists into the Union, particularly those of the more agrarian slave states. But what of modern history? Indeed, it is the history of the realignment of the major political parties in the United States that reveals the nature of the Electoral College's white supremacist power. 1. The first law of thermodynamics. 1948. Quote, "The presidential campaign of 1948 marked the first in a series of efforts by white Southern politicians to manipulate the machinery of the Electoral College to influence the national debate on civil rights. In that year, Southern Democrats in 4 states abandoned their party's nominee, President Harry S. Truman, and threw their support behind a segregationist ticket headed by J. Strom Thurmond, the Democratic governor of South Carolina." End quote. This was no aberration. Quote, "This strategy had an important historical antecedent. In 1876, much of the South was still under military control as part of Congress's Reconstruction program. In the presidential election that year, Democrat Samuel J. Tilden won a popular vote victory over Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. The electoral vote results, however, were unclear, largely because of confusion and allegations of fraud in 3 southern states. A special commission consisting of 5 senators, 5 members of the House of Representatives, and 5 Supreme Court justices was set up to investigate the vote. It ultimately awarded all of the disputed electoral votes to Hayes, making him the apparent winner. In order for Hayes to be formally elected, however, Congress had to approve the count. With less than 3 days to go before the inauguration, Democrats in the House threatened to block approval. Ultimately, Hayes agreed to remove federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction in exchange for Democratic agreement to accept him as president. Shortly after the election, Hayes kept his part of the bargain, resulting in the near total loss of all civil and political rights for Southern blacks. In 1948, a successful challenge by Thurmond could have perpetrated that result." End quote. One of the proponents and architects bringing this ethos from the grave, Charles Wallace Collins, had this to say of efforts to end Jim Crow and extend the New Deal. Quote, "These groups," here he's referring to, in his own words, Negroes and the New York City Radicals, "with ever-increasing pressure during the past 10 years, are attempting to drive the South into a corner of moral isolation on the Negro race question as a vantage point for hostile action. I have shown how these organizations are rallying to a new philosophy, the slogan of which is the word democracy, which in its very concept condemns in one breath the whole Southern system, and how the whole movement is anchored to a craftily conceived legislative program to make the Negro equal to the white man economically, politically, and socially." End quote. Efforts that, in Collins' opinion, should be fought through a new conservative coalition with Northern and Western Republicans. Quote, "There are 2 weapons of respectability available to the South which cannot be taken away from her without her consent, namely, her almost certain ability to prevent the Constitution from being amended, and her power in the Electoral College. I have pointed out the logic of the conversion of the present Republican Southern Democratic coalition into a new conservative political party. If that cannot be done, it would be better for the South to fight independently in the Electoral College than to continue to keep political company with the left-wing New Dealers, who are, at heart, the South's most bitter enemies." End quote. 2. The Free Electors Movement, 1960. Electors need not be pledged. They are elected to a slate of electors through various processes depending on the state, but I won't get into that. Voters do not vote for president. They vote for a slate of electors. What matters is, it was typical for all delegates to be pledged to vote in favor of the party's nominee. Southern Democrats decided to get some renegade electors on their slates in order to pressure the nominee. JFK managed to assuage radicals by selecting LBJ, a Southern Senate Majority Leader from Texas, as his running mate. But this movement scored more than a dozen successes throughout the Deep South. Quote, "Alabama newspapers backed the idea of an electoral revolt on openly segregationist grounds, condemning federal efforts to force racial mixing in New Orleans and the enslavement of Southern children as a result of school integration efforts." End quote. Ultimately, Kennedy won too big, and then died too hard, for this strategy to affect him directly. But the South still feared the second coming of Reconstruction, and they weren't done cracking just yet. 3. The Wallace Campaign and the Rise of the Republican South. This one's all about Alabama Governor George C. Wallace. You know, the segregation forever guy. The major difference here is that Wallace aimed to be on the ballot in all 50 states, and succeeded, largely because civil rights was now a 50 states issue in the wake of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Quote, "Beginning with the 1965 Watts riots in Los Angeles, a series of violent disturbances in urban black neighborhoods had forced race to the forefront of the nation's political consciousness. In 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King touched off a wave of riots in more than 100 cities throughout the nation, resulting in 39 deaths and almost 20,000 arrests." End quote. Both Nixon and Wallace ran law and order campaigns. The dog whistles here were not subtle. Wallace's strategy revolved around picking up enough electors to wrangle Nixon over to the side of segregation. Quote, "Thurmond and other one-time Democrats threw their support behind Nixon. The Southern strategy paid off. Not just for Nixon in 1968, but for the Republican Party. By appealing to the white segregationist bloc that had controlled Southern politics since the end of Reconstruction, Nixon captured 6 Southern states: Florida, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. Wallace won another 5 states: Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Once again, the winner-take-all system ensured that African-American voters, unlikely to support either Wallace or the Thurmond-backed Nixon, could not choose a single elector in these 11 states." End quote. The material outcomes of the American electoral system. The way our states are carved up effectively packs and cracks minorities at the federal level, just as districting functions to pack and crack them at the state level. But of course it does. It was designed that way. I've remarked upon the white supremacist nature of state formation, but let's look at today's districting and gerrymandering schemes. Quote, "In a year in which Democrats picked up as many as 41 House seats elsewhere, including in places as conservative as Oklahoma and Utah, they appeared to lose all 3 of their targets for pickups in one of the nation's most closely divided states. Democrats in North Carolina earned 48.3% of the total vote cast in House races, but appeared to win only 3 seats. Republicans had 50.4% of the vote and won at least 9 seats." End quote. It's not just Republicans. Maryland was so badly gerrymandered that its maps were struck down in 2018, but that's not the point I want to get at. I'm still talking Electoral College and the Deep South, and I want to talk about something specific. Blue states pay more in taxes than they get back, generally. Red states get more than they pay, generally. Doesn't this contradict my argument that the Electoral College doesn't help historically exploited or oppressed people? It doesn't, because 1. The descendants of slaves do not control the Deep South. The descendants of slave masters do. 2. The most industrialized states in the Union are effectively exploiting the less developed ones. The first point, I hope, is obvious enough owing to the previous sections. So let's discuss the second point. The Deep South used to have the highest concentration of millionaires on Earth. It wasn't just the wealthiest area of the United States, but arguably in the entire world. Unfortunately, beyond slavery being evil, it's also economically backwards. The ownership classes invest in machine power to save on labor costs. But what's the point of doing that when labor, in the form of slaves, is nearly free? The Northeast began to industrialize long before the Southeast did, and when that whole owning human being things went bust, they were left with none of the infrastructure the rest of the country had been building up. The result? By the time the Roaring Twenties rolled around, this was the poorest region of the nation, with the Mideast, Far West, and New England pulling in 2.5 to 3 times as much income. The New Deal, that thing Collins was calling evil, if you'll recall, was meant to ameliorate this. These programs were intended to address the uneven development inherent to capitalism by having a tax and spend regime where the state would come in and industrialize these rural areas. You can see the income and prosperity in the country begin to converge throughout this era. By the end of it, the Southeast was losing out to the wealthiest regions by a factor of just 1.5 or so. You want to guess when that stopped? When did it start reversing? The Reagan years. The West Coast and New England were able to survive deindustrialization by becoming hubs of finance capital, the East Coast, and merchant capital, the West Coast. The rest of the country, especially the South, now basically sells off its natural resources, too poor to become a hub of tech or usury, but too rich to compete with the labor costs of the Third World. It reminds me of what we did to, say, the Ukraine. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic used to be the wealthiest. After the counter-revolution, it was restructured into a neoliberal backwater that survives by selling off its natural gas and oil to actual industrial powers. The far-right politics of the reactionary middle-class white people controlling the South are oriented towards maintaining a specific kind of social ladder. This necessitates resource hoarding and political ossification, which leads to less wealth being produced overall. The relatively wealthy folks in control don't really mind because they really can benefit from the reduced cost of living, but the situation for everybody else, the captive, impoverished, largely non-white population, is reflected by the far worse physical quality of life outcomes in this region. In the new Jim Crow, this is the new 3/5 compromise. These states get more representatives and electoral votes on the back of a deeply impoverished population with no political rights. Red states are approaching USSR during World War II levels of incarceration, with Oklahoma leading the pack at nearly 1% of its population behind bars. Those folks can't vote, but they do count towards more representatives. About 1/8 of the black male population can't vote, but they do boost representative numbers. It's possible to just go on and on about this. The more repressive states act as a bulwark. Quote, the 3 electors in Wyoming represent an average of 187,923 residents each. The 55 electors in California represent an average of 677,355 people each. And that's a disparity of 3.6 to 1. Political polarization plus a lack of democracy typically leads to civil war. But on that topic, who's excited about the next Marvel film? So that's it. I hope I didn't lead anybody into believing that the USSR was some kind of ultra success story. They had a lot of really interesting things with regards to sexism and nationalism and radical new forms of democracy. A lot of that fizzled out during the years of the Civil War, though. And while some of it made a bit of a resurgence in the 30s, that really did start to peter out with the Yezhovshchina and the Second World War, and it never really came back. Women were pushed into motherhood, and a lot of these national apparatuses were Russified in the name of efficiency, which follows a lot of the same logic as capitalist powers. There was a big push toward heavy machinery and quickly industrializing, because if you don't have enough machine power, you really can't compete, and then you end up like Mississippi. You just sort of fall behind into ruin.